Good afternoon and welcome to today's APM webinar, The Value of Assurance with Roy Millard. I'm Robert Allen, APM Branches Manager, and I'll be your host today. Firstly, I'd like to wish everyone well, and it's great to see so many people online today. Please be aware that today's webinar, you are currently in listen-only mode, but that's not to say we don't want you to get involved. On your main control panel, you'll see a question function. Please post your questions in there, and at the end, Roy is happy to answer any of these questions. This session will count towards your CPD and should last for about an hour. I would like to personally thank the volunteers of the Assurance SIG and the branches and all our volunteers for all your hard work during this time to get these webinars up and running. So, Roy is the chair of our APM Assurance SIG and works as P3 Risk and Assurance, providing advice and support on matters of governance, risk and assurance in project organisations. So, on that note, it's my pleasure to pass over to Roy to give today's webinar. Thanks, Roy.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for joining my webinar today on the topic of value of assurance. It's clearly struck a nerve. There's some clearly currency around the topic of assurance. We had over 500 registrations for today's webinar, and certainly just before we came on air, we got 200 people actually logging into it. So welcome to you all. Before we really get started, I'd like to find out a little bit about you, where you are, and what sort of role you have in terms of assurance. Now, to do this, we're going to run, sorry, my screen had frozen, sorry. I'm going to ask you two questions, and we're going to use something called Mentimeter. Mentimeter, I think some of you probably have used before. It's used quite a lot on webinars and on APM webinars, I believe. It's a separate website. So if you have a tablet, a mobile device, if I could ask you to go to, using a web browser, go to that website address, www.menti.com. It will ask you for a meeting code, and that should be the correct code there, 716866. So I will give you a moment just to do that, and then I will swap over to the Mentimeter screen, and we'll go into the two questions. Okay, oh, right, goodness, we've already got people filling it in. Excellent, right, okay. I'll wait until buttoning down in terms of the voting. So not surprisingly, okay, but interesting, which is brilliant. I'm really interested to see that level of geographical spread. Okay, I think probably so, and we have 229 voters. So I think I'll move on to the next question now. The cloud question, just to type in the box your job title. Job titles. By far the greatest, and program manager, senior project manager. Impression that we are talking for whom providers of assurance. Time we should move on. So thank you very much for doing that. That's 300 when we get to that point on the presentation. So the agenda, I often, when I start talking about doing an assurance talk, I like to spend a little bit of time typically talking about what is assurance, because it's surprising how many people have different views to what assurance is and what it isn't. And having some clarity, certainly from the point of view of the assurance SIG and how we think about it, I think can be very useful. So we have a few slides around defining that what is assurance. And you've really got to have some clarity around that, and some a better understanding of the full breadth of what is assurance before one can really start talking about how you can get the best value from assurance, or how to deliver value from assurance. So having done the what is assurance, move on then to the two sides of a coin, I think, about delivering value. One is around getting the best value from the assurance you do. So if you're doing some assurance work, how do you make sure you do it most efficiently, most effectively, get the best value you can for the money you're spending on it and the resources you're spending on it? And then the other side of the coin then is perhaps more important for the world, more important for yourselves, is having got assurance, how do you make sure it has the biggest impact? How do you get the best value for your organization, for your project from doing that? And I will spend quite a bit of time talking about the two sides of the coin. I will then talk a little bit about value drive, because that's what it really comes down to, I think. And I'll give a couple of examples of some value drivers that have been defined by a couple of organisations that presented at our assurance conference back in November of last year. All this will help lead really on to building a business case for assurance. Is how if you're trying to justify spend on assurance, how do you do it? What are the approaches that one can use and the difficulties? So I'll spend a little bit of time talking about that. And this is then when we go back to Intermeter, and I've got a few questions around who makes the decisions within your organisations around assurance. Who are the movers and shakers? Who holds the purse strings? And now we'll round off my presentation in around some thoughts from yourselves about where the assurance SIG should focus its efforts in the future. And if we have time, we will hopefully move on to maybe being able to answer some of your questions that you're going to send in, that Rob's going to pass through to me. Okay, starting to talk about what is assurance. And I said that assurance can mean different things to different people. And it's largely to do with context. Well, a lot of it's to do with context. It's to do with the role. It's about the individual and what it is that they need. So the sort of questions that get asked, or the sort of statements that get made around needing assurance are those. Just as a few samples there. Needing to know that everything is under control. I need to know whether what I'm being told is correct. I need to be confident that I'm going to get what I want. And you could sort of fit those sort of statements against particular types of role, maybe a project sponsor or a project manager or a customer, somebody who's having a project delivered to them. They would all have a slightly different perspective of what it is they mean by assurance, because it's the specific answer to their question that they're trying to seek. It's quite interesting that when we started promoting this webinar, clearly, as I said at the beginning, it's obviously got some common currency, and a lot of you are interested in the topic. However, there was one reaction to it, to me posting something on LinkedIn, which was around, this is why is this a particularly interesting subject to have now? Aren't there things which are sort of more important for us to be dealing with in today's world, in this time of pandemic? And this is it's a constant concern as far as the assurance SIG is concerned. And it's actually, assurance is generally seen as an add-on. It's not seen as an intrinsic part of project delivery. I don't think anybody would say that, risk management wouldn't be a hot topic at any time. But really, assurance is just another part of that lens of risk management. So it's slightly odd, really, that sort of challenge should come up. And it really is, I believe, a very good time to be addressing these questions, how to get the best value from assurance. So what is assurance? It's got some definitions. There's a couple of dictionary definitions I refer to. Really, I show these really mostly from the point of view of trying to demonstrate that one of the difficulties around the term assurance and the way it can mean things to different people is, for some people, assurance is a thing. It's a review report, or it's an audit report, or it's something like that. It's something tangible, a thing. Whereas for others, assurance is a process. So the mere fact of reporting in an independent way, for example, provides some assurance. And when thinking about assurance in the broadest terms, you have to think of it in terms of this sort of this activity as well as a specific thing. These are quite dry, these sort of definitions. I rather like this quote from W.E. Deming, which is, as it says, "In God we trust, all others bring data." And really what that's getting at is that assurance has to have some aspect that is at least partly independent from the thing that the assurance is applying to. The APM has a definition in the Body of Knowledge 7, book 7, which is the process of providing confidence to stakeholders that projects, programs, and portfolios will achieve their objectives for beneficial change. Now, one can argue whether that's a perfectly good definition or not, but that's the one that we have in box 7. But it is particularly interesting because it's got, as I've just highlighted there, this phrase, providing confidence. And that really is what assurance is about. It's about providing confidence. However you do, whatever it looks like, if it's helping you to provide confidence, then it basically ticks the box of assurance. It is of course, the assurance doesn't necessarily tell you always that a project is going to meet its objectives for beneficial change. It may tell you the otherwise, and then recommend things to do about it to sort of remedy that situation. So it's probably more to do with providing confidence that things will be done to ensure that projects, programs, and portfolios will achieve their objectives for beneficial change. But this provision of confidence is the key point, I think, there to try and remember. When you're thinking about what something is, it's sometimes also interesting to think about what it isn't. And you can actually, I've picked on a few things here. Some of them are a bit debatable, but they all hopefully will stimulate a thought as to, well, why am I saying that? So subjective. Subjective, this is a bit like the W.E. Deming quote just now about bring data. A subjective opinion really is not assurance. And that can be linked to trust. Trust can sometimes be a basis for assurance if the person or the mechanism that you're trusting actually has a record, has clarity that it can be trusted, that it is independent, then trust can have some element of assurance in it. But generally speaking, it's not a word that you would see used in assurance. Historic is an interesting one as well, in that historic generally means just looking backwards. So often audits are often said to be, well, an audit isn't assurance because it's just all about looking backwards and what's happened in the past. Well, firstly, that's not what audits are about, only what audits are about. But also, just you can look at the history, and if you're looking for trends, that does actually help you to start thinking about what's happening today and what would be happening in the future. But it isn't only historic. Just looking at the history of something really doesn't give you any assurance about what's going to happen in the future. I'll pick on one more, just periodic reporting. Just periodic reporting, where it's just what the project manager is saying or the PMO is saying, it is not sufficient on its own. However, if that periodic reporting is done through a system that can't be sanitized in any way, can't be adjusted in any way, then it will itself provide you some assurance. But just simple periodic reporting does not have sufficient independence in it to constitute assurance. And of course, another way of looking at assurance is where it comes from and where it goes. So starting off on who provides assurance, this is just an example of a few mechanisms, functions that provide assurance. Some of them are very obvious assurance, like OGC Gateway, independent assurance reviews, project audits. So they are clearly things which are assurance functions. One or two of them may be less so, like a system, for example. Does a system really provide assurance? Well, absolutely, it can do. If one thinks in terms of the three lines of defence model for assurance, which I haven't got time to go into today. So hopefully you'll know what that is. But essentially, the second line of defence in an organisation is our systems and processes, policies that are put in place to try and ensure that risks don't adversely impact an activity. So systems can actually very much provide assurance. And then you can look and see, well, who receives assurance? Where does it go? And this is a few examples. And I often found the reason I overlay those two things is for two reasons. One is to demonstrate that, in fact, sometimes customers are also providers of assurance. So, for example, a project sponsor would actually be a customer of assurance, but may well be having to provide assurance to shareholders and other stakeholders. So very often, if I'm doing a face-to-face live in a room talk, I will often ask people to say whether they were a customer or a provider of assurance. Yeah, and it's surprising how many people actually have to put their hands twice for both of those things. And the other reason I do it is because it's quite complex. It shows actually just in one slide the number of functions groups for whom assurance is an important topic. And it just sort of surprises me just how little assurance is generally a topic of conversation when talking about project delivery. When I speak to the Association of Project Management, APM, the executive team there, about what the priorities are for APM, their priorities are set very much by what the world wants from APM, their corporate partners, for example. Assurance is not a topic that comes up very often. And it just strikes me, and it strikes the assurance seekers, very odd and really out of step with actually the real importance of the topic to all of these groups of people. Okay, so that's pretty much all I wanted to say about what assurance is and what it isn't. So hopefully that's given you the flavour. I wanted to move on to something which I will talk when I go on to a future slide about the various dimensions of value. But one of the things that really you have to have in place to make sure you can get proper value from your assurance is a framework where all of these providers and all these customers' assurance are actually integrated in some sort of framework. And we have in the Assurance SIG, we defined 6 principles of assurance. And for assurance to work effectively in an organisation, such that it can be integrated together and you can actually proactively manage it, coordinate it, and maximise its value, is any assurance really has to meet these 6 criteria. You'll see there that it's from the APM Guide to Integrated Assurance. It was a guide that we published, some of you may know about it, back in 2014. And it's available free to members from the APM website. So I'm just going to run through these a little. We're not going to spend a lot of time on them because, as I said, you can go away and look at them in the book there. So independence is one of the key priorities. And as I said earlier about this sort of in God we trust, but all others bring data. This element of independence is an essential part of assurance. So unless there is assured, there's that word again, assured independence within a function, within a product, it's got to be questioned as to its value in assurance as assurance. Any assurance people have to be accountable to it. It has to people have to make it happen. Make it happen in a particular way, in a particularly disciplined way. If you don't do that, it doesn't happen. And you can't guarantee the independence which needs to underlie that assurance. Planning coordination, it can't just be ad hoc. It needs to be people need to know it's going to happen. It needs to be it needs to be fed out to the right places at the right time. The right people need to be involved. It needs to be budgeted for. It needs to be put into the project plans. Again, otherwise it won't happen, or it'll happen in a very disorganised and ineffective way. Proportionate is a really important one, and we will come back to that on the when I get onto the slide around the dimensions of value. If assurance is seen as not being proportionate, and is a danger, actually, in some organisations where assurance is very traditional and it's been done a particular way for a long time, sometimes that assurance is not proportionate. The right assurance is not carried out on the right things at the right time, and that can get assurance a very bad name very quickly, because it gives the impression that time is being wasted, projects are being interfered with unnecessarily, and stakeholders just don't seem to see the value of it. Why are you doing that piece of assurance now? On that particular thing, there are far more important things to be focusing on. I said earlier on about we would not think in terms of risk as being not a hot topic at any time, and assurance is intrinsically linked with risk. If you're doing some assurance, providing some assurance, it really has to be linked to some risk. If there's no risk, there really isn't any point in you doing any assurance on it. So your starting point when planning risk activity under this planning and coordination has to be an understanding of where the risks are. And then what you're providing assurance around is the management of those risks. And of course, there's the other side of risk as well. There's the opportunity side of risk as well, which is probably more of an opportunity and a benefit of doing assurance rather than a key requirement for it. And then impact and follow-up and escalation. Assurance that does not lead to action to rectify things which are going wrong, to improve, is again of little value. It's the sort of the assurance report that just sits on the shelf that nobody does anything with. So if there is a review, for example, there should always be some recommendations. There should always be some actions that are agreed, and there should always be some follow-up. And there should also be then some escalation if the appropriate follow-up is not done. And that's really an intrinsic part of making sure that assurance doesn't just provide information about whether a project is going to be successful or not. It actually actively tries to improve the probability of success of that project. You'll see that this is actually the principle of integrated assurance. So if you look at that book, you actually see there's a table of principles of assurance and principles integrated assurance. What I've really shown you is the principle of integrated assurance there. But my argument really is that unless you're doing assurance in an integrated way, then you're actually up a gum tree as far as obtaining real value from it. So I tend to try and really quite equate the two things together. This is just a shot of the guide. Okay, then moving on to delivering value. So this is quite a busy slide that will build up over a period of the next few minutes. And as I said earlier, I see there's two sides to a coin of value of assurance. And it pays to separate the two things out. One really is about assurance, and as I said, I think I said this when I was going through the agenda. One is around ensuring that the assurance that you do, the assurance that you have, provides maximum value within the organisation. The other side of the coin is having decided you're going to do some assurance. How do you make sure you get the best value out of that, the spend on assurance? I'm taking a little bit of a poetic license here, but I think for me it's sort of split is the bit on the left is around doing the right projects. It's about maximizing organization benefit from the value from the assurance. So it's a portfolio level type thing, consideration or perspective. Whilst getting the best value is more on the doing the project's right side, the getting the best value from it, and it's more at the project level. And I'm going to go through now a few bullet points on each of those to sort of indicate where I think that the main components for assuring that one ticks the box on both sides of that. So first of all, on the getting the maximum organisational benefit, assurance needs to link to governance. It needs to support decision making. It needs to support decision making. It needs to be provided to the right people at the right time and cover the right topics. So, for example, a good example of that is the gate reviews. Gate reviews being carried out and then feeding into gate review decisions for allowing a project to move from one stage to another. That sometimes, very often, is an ad hoc thing in organisations. There is to really get value from assurance, actually demonstrably linking those activities, that assurance, to the decision making in project boards, steering groups, whatever. It is a key thing to do. One can sell the assurance, the value of assurance, from a governance point of view, in as much as I think it provides a mechanism for stopping projects. Stopping projects, I think we all know, is notoriously difficult to do. And often it's because there isn't a clear criteria on which an organisation should decide or otherwise to stop a project. Assurance can be the basis for doing that. In the same way as it can be a basis for making a decision for moving one phase to another, it can actually be used as a decision as to whether a project should actually stop or not. And of course, it'll also be more on the opportunity side, which is going to be a catalyst of change. I did 15 years worth of time at Transport for London in a senior internal audit role, and I would see the same sort of issues arising again and again. Some were around processes, some around organisation. They are quite useful things that you can distill out of a lot of insurance information, feed back into an organisation's board and say, actually, there's a systemic problem here. If you were to do this, if you were to make this sort of organisational change, you'd actually address a lot of the issues that we get on around project delivery. So, catalyst for change. And it's often there's quite a difficult one for people to get their head around sometimes around assurance, because assurance is very often seen as very negative. It's about finding fault. It's about finding things to stop. The corrective actions is the sort of language that tends to get used. This sort of idea of improvement, I think, is not generally thought of as being something you can get from assurance. Links risk management, which I've already talked a little bit about, or quite a bit about actually, and assurance really is the selling points for it is actually about making it gives you views as to whether risks are under control, and typically the sort of activities that go in organisations around risk management and the activities that go in around assurance are not particularly joined up. They may be in a sort of tacit way, but they're not linked together in any sort of formal way. So the conversations around the risk and the conversation around assurance are not necessarily carried out at the same time, the same people. And actually, if you can do that, then that really helps to demonstrate why the assurance activity and the assurance information is of value to the organisation. And of course, it doesn't necessarily just give you credible view as to whether risks under control. It does actually, it can flag up quite early on when they are not, when they're not under control. Sometimes in advance of where a risk management process could in itself pick it up. That's something that come out of risk assurance trends, for example. Because spotting the unspotted, because assurance providers look at a project from a different perspective, a different point of view, they're not day-to-day involved in the delivery. Things can be spotted that others aren't spotting. Now, one could probably think of a number of quite significant projects. One very major one recently, where apparently things have not been going, we're not going right, but nobody spotted it and nobody did anything about it. I would argue that if the assurance had been working well and properly, then that would have been spotted, it would have been acted on. And indeed, one of the findings around that particular project was that the assurance mechanisms had been effectively downgraded quite dramatically at around the time that the spotting of the unspotted would have been done. And again, the fourth one there is this sort of turning the thing on its head. It actually helps to identify opportunities that, again, this other perspective may actually try and boost the opportunity side of risk management, which having been a risk manager in the past and dealt with a lot with risk management in the past, I know that's a real challenge, getting people to think in terms of the opportunity side of risk. Assurance can be used to try and help bolster that as well. Very important that project assurance is linked to corporate assurance. And so this corporate assurance, there's an obvious one around internal audit, but there are other types of, there's health and safety, environmental, all sorts of assurance that goes on within an organisation, financial assurance, external audit. I wonder how much in your organisations, for example, that your project assurance functions and processes are linked in any way to the overall corporate assurance processes. Do they talk to each other? Do they share information? Is there trust between them? Do they work together collaboratively? The point around competence in meeting business priorities. Again, my 15 years in internal audit, when we were doing an audit plan every year, we would look at the strategic risks of TfL, and our audit plan was around the strategic risks. And the strategic risk, there was one strategic risk around the investment program delivery. And I went to great lengths to ensure that the work that I was responsible for, and generally assurance within TfL, fed into the TfL's audit board and audit committee around that particular risk. That's the language that boards and audit committees understand. They've got this big set of strategic objectives. They've got this big register of all the things the organisation is doing. If you want to make sure that project assurance gets onto their agenda, you've got to link it to the things that they're spending their time thinking about. And the sort of strategic risk register is one of those things. And a good way of doing that is to link into the ongoing corporate assurance processes. Managing the outputs, few aspects to this. Terminology and language being meaningful. Assurance providers do tend to talk in terms of their own language, which isn't necessarily the language of boards. So actually making sure that the way in which you present the outputs from assurance using terminology and language to the people you're sending it to, you're providing it to, is important, otherwise they will miss the point. One does have to be quite careful with this. I used to have discussions with directors at TfL where you'd be providing them with a whole set of consolidated information around assurance, and the question would be, well, so what should I do about this? What conclusion should I draw from this? And you've really got to, you can only go so far. And then you're starting to take the responsibility away from those decision makers. So it's a balance you've got to get right. So you've got to put things in a language and a terminology that the people who need to make the decisions quickly understand the significance of and what they need to do about them. And part of that is visibility at the right levels and the right places. So that will depend on the type of assurance that you're doing. Is it a steering group? Is it a project board? Is it the audit board, the organisation's board, the audit committee? Is it some sort of assurance panel? Is it a group of external stakeholders? And making sure that the assurance you're providing is actually visible to those people at the right places. And of course, there's a point about timeliness as well. The just too late piece of assurance is not really much use to anybody at all. So if there's a gate review coming up, you've got to make sure that your assurance is ready for that gate review. If there's a board meeting coming up, which you may only have a few a year, you've got to make sure that all of your reporting is all lined up and available at the time, ready. Business partners. This was an idea we started to introduce within TfL, and this is the idea of assurance just being more integrated into the working day of people that are delivering projects. So whereas, again, what typically happens with doing an assurance review, for example, is that a project will hear nothing from the assurance team review until suddenly there's an assurance review that needs to be done. And it sort of comes out to the blue to them. So I was always advocate that assurance functions should try very hard to have a business partnering type of relationship with the projects and the organisation functions that they are providing the assurance over. So there's an ongoing relationship that breeds trust and dependency and reliability on either way, and can ensure helping with things like terminology, language, timeliness of the assurance, because the assurance really understands where the project is, and the project really understands what the assurance needs to do. Proportionality, which I talked about just now in terms of the 6 principles of assurance. I'm talking about it again now because I can't stress more enough this point about making sure that the people making decisions, senior people making decisions in organisations, they are not going to be interested in assurance that they do not think is around things that they are just not worried about. It needs to be proportional to where the risks are, where the problems are that individual, those directors are having to deal with day to day, and they constantly have to sort of baseline to make sure your assurance is proportional to what the organisation is most concerned about at the time. Don't be expensive is a rather flippant one, assurance is very much seen as an overhead, and at TfL I experienced this a number of times where organisation has to cut costs. Assurance is a prime place to go to cut costs because it's so hard to justify why you need to spend money on assurance. I'm going to come back to that subject again in a minute. So this perception of being expensive is a real problem, and we did experience that at times at TfL because we did not put enough effort into ensuring that the value of what we do was really understood. So we were perceived, by internal audit, we were perceived as being expensive. And there's a couple of sort of opportunity types, which is you can use assurance information for stakeholder communications. So how much more weight one could give to some stakeholder comms if you can actually refer to the fact that some real assurance work has been done, and this was the outcome from the assurance work, provides sort of a little bit more basis for those sort of communications, I think. And this is one very much for the future, I think, and that is custodian of corporate knowledge. So things like lessons learned, post-implementation reviews, ensuring the organisation really does promulgate out the learnings from things that have happened in the past. Not traditionally something assurance functions have been doing. I think it's a real potential growth area for assurance. They are brilliant. A reviewer, an internal auditor, for example, looking at projects, is in a brilliant position to be able to feed back to the organisation lessons that are drawn out from the assurance work that's being done. A lot of work I think can be done there, but I think there's huge potential. So that's the left hand. That's the sort of the maximising organisational benefit. And I'm going to move on to the right hand side, which is having decided to do some assurance. How do you get the best value from it? There's a bit of overlap between the two, so good relationships and communication. So this is a bit like the business partnership thing. If you're going to do an assurance review, you're going to get the most value out of it if you have a good relationship with the team that you're doing an insurance review on. They know that it's going to happen. They know what you're going to look at. They know what's going to happen with the outcome afterwards. Feeding back outputs from the review as you go through, maintaining those communications, really good, really key to getting the best value out of a review. And for goodness sake, use knowledgeable, skilled, knowledgeable assurance staff, people who actually know, they have some insight into the activities and the risks. I used to, in my internal audit function, I'm a project manager and engineer by background. So all of my internal audit work at TfL was from the point of view of an insight into how you go about delivering projects. There is a view certainly within the world of internal audit, is an auditor can audit anything. And I've never found that to be the case. You do need to have good knowledge about what it is, for two reasons. One, because you need to ask the right question to be looking at the right things. So you're being proportional and you're being risk-based, but also because you need to be credible. So that's about the good relationships and communications as well. So if your assurance staff are credible to the people they are providing the assurance over, then you're going to get, again, more value, more cooperation, more value from that review. Ensuring that positive actions are taken. So another one of those 6 principles of assurance talked about earlier. It's too easy just to provide some assurance and say, that's it, my job's done. Throw it over the fence, provided it's up to the project sponsor, project manager, whoever, to decide what to do with it and use it as they want to. That's not enough. Assurance has to be followed through. And again, you're going to get far more value out of your assurance review if you can actually ensure that positive action is taken from it. Close link to project lifecycle. This is more of a lower level one around timing. Making sure that you plan your assurance work around a project lifecycle, so you're looking at the right things at the right time. Assurance is an intrinsic part of P3 and project program and portfolio management. I often think assurance in projects is somewhere where risk management was, I don't know, 10 years ago. When I used to be a risk manager, not long ago that, in fact, but it was seen at that time as being, again, an add-on. I don't think anybody would see risk management as being an add-on to project management now. It's an intrinsic part of it. And if you can, as an assurance provider within an organization, if you can get your organization to see P3, see assurance as another part of the project management framework, project management activity, again, it'll be much easier to get some value out of your assurance work. Implementing an integrated assurance framework, which I talked about earlier on. And this is another thing which is more for the future. And I know there's a number of organizations who are looking at this. Projects generate an awful lot of data. There is a lot of opportunity there to use data in a more passive, ongoing way to look for trends in activity, trends in delivery, and make some predictions for the future. And there's a lot of work going on around use of that and use of artificial intelligence and machine learning. We did touch on that on our assurance conference the year before last, and it's something which we are planning to take forward within the assurance SIG more. It's also a part of the wider topic of use of data in project management, which the APM are pursuing as part of their Projecting There for the Future program that they have in place. So the more that you can use information that's already there within your organization to draw conclusions around assurance, again, the more value you're going to get out of the time and money you spend on it. Right, so that completes that rather busy slide, apart from this point about identifying value drivers. That's a fairly generic set of principles. The extent to which they apply will very much depend on the nature of the organization, the nature of the projects that the organization is doing, and the priorities for that organization. And really, it's like most things about assurance, actually. There are a lot of general principles, but the way you apply them actually very much depends on the organization, and needs to be thought and planned and designed. So when thinking, one of the things I would be suggesting to yourselves is, after this talk, if you want to go back to your organizations, to think about, how do I get better value from my assurance? Start thinking about the assurance drivers. What are the things that you can do that would hit the things the organisation is most worried about. I've got a couple of examples. We had this, as I said earlier, we had our assurance conference last November, and this topic of assurance drivers came up, and two of our speakers spent some time talking about what the drivers are from within their organisations. The first one was Lloyds Banking Group. No, I'm not going to go through all these. You can see what they say, and I'm not an expert on them. The guy from Lloyd's was. I'm putting them there for illustration, really. That was something that they built up. He built up with Lloyd's Bank as being the things that he needs to bear in mind if he's planning assurance work and executing assurance work. What are the things that are most important to Lloyd's Banking Group? What's going to get the assurance onto their agenda? So arguably, if there's some assurance work that's going on that really doesn't meet any of these value drivers, should it really be being done? And then there's another one, Network Rail. Obviously presented in a different way as well. There's a list of bullet points, and there is I'm sure there's some similarity between the two, but again, it's a different perspective. Whereas Lloyds Bank, it's a highly regulated financial institution, largely which their business is done through information technology. Network Rail is obviously a very regulated operational organisation where it's moving passengers around. Very different type of business, not surprisingly going to have a different set of value drivers. And if you're going to ensure that your assurance really provides value in your organisation, you've really got to understand how it fits in with the value drivers for that organisation. This is another slide which I'm not going to dwell on for very long, because we're starting to ask the question as to, well, what is the right amount of assurance to carry out? So if we're going to try and build a business case, for example, how much spend should we spend on assurance? How much resource, how much money should we be spending? And this was some figures that KPMG, a speaker from KPMG, put up at our conference. And again, it's not what I'm going to go into in detail. I just really put it up there to demonstrate the spread. So you've got everything from like 5.5% of overall spend is on program assurance. That's the online retailer on the right hand side, right up to right next to it 6% within an insurance company. Which is right, which is wrong? I don't know. It illustrates just what's really what I'm saying is about. It's very hard to determine what is the right amount of spend, and it will vary from one organisation to another, and the rules of thumb just don't really exist. KPMG, they try to pull out, so at the top there, typically in the region of 2 to 5%. That's a big range of spend. So this already takes us on to the question as to, well, how do you justify spending money on assurance? How do you build a business case for assurance? Well, you can do it in a sort of qualitative way. You can describe the benefits, as I've been talking about just now. So you get better planning from it. You get quicker delivery, reduced costs. You can make arguments about all these things, but they are largely subjective. They're largely qualitative. How do you prove any of those things really within a business case? You can give anecdotal examples. They're few and far between. Where there were occasions where we did internal audits in TfL where there was clearly an action that was taken following an audit that saved money. For example, if fraud is identified. But those sort of situations are rare. Assurance really is about looking forward and stopping things going wrong in the future. How do you assess the sort of the financial value of doing that? Very hard to do. And you can link to your risk budgets and contingencies. Now, I think this is an area that's worth spending more time thinking about. Organisation projects will have a risk budget and will have contingencies squirreled away, which are linked to risk. I often hear talk about risk budgets and contingencies being reduced as you go through a life of a project, as risks get retired off. Again, it's very subjective generally. Is there a way of tying assurance activity into those decisions around releasing risk budgets and contingencies. There's a potential way of putting a pound sign against the activity, but it's certainly not an established way of doing it. So you got this sort of problem as to benefit cost ratio. How do you put that together? How do you justify that? And where we are, the level of thinking we are at as far as the SIG is concerned, is that we need to do some research around this. The APM, we managed to convince the APM of this. And for those of you who don't know, they have a research budget, and they invite submissions for elements, for bits of that budget every year. And one of the two key themes for this year is value of assurance. So we are very hopeful that we might be able to get something more, a sounder scientific basis for this assertion that doing good assurance is a good thing, based upon some academic research. I don't have the timescales for that research yet, but hopefully sometime later on this year into next year, we would have the output from that research. Okay, so that's really my final slide. I would like to, well, it's not quite a final slide, it's a final main presentation slide. I'd like to just ask a couple more questions around who makes the decisions within your organisations? Because as I said, assurance is, everybody sees that it's a really important topic, but it's not something that gets raised to the strategic level as to something that the project management profession needs to spend more time thinking about. So there's a disconnect for me, between the people who think assurance is important and the people who actually make the decisions within organisations about it. So I'm going to ask you to go to menti.com again, please. It's a different code, I'm afraid, but if you put in the other code, and there are two questions. If I move on to that now. So the first question is, who makes decisions about project assurance? And this is in your organisation, and you may not know, of course. Okay, so of course some of the spread would be because not all those titles actually exist within organisations, but PMO is coming out very strongly at a time in due course. Okay, in the interest of time, we've only got a few minutes left, so let's move on to the next. I'm not sure what that was, to see the two. Some of this information to try and see. Okay, we're slowing down now. Like onto the final slide on here, and this is another word cloud. Past the assurance SIG is useful, particularly from a group of people who are predominantly obviously on the delivery side. What do you think we should be concentrating on to make your jobs easier? I'm going to have to close. Well, thank you. I have to go back. Actually, that will probably stay open because I'm just going to swap screen back to mine. I wanted to.
Perfect. Thank you, Roy. That presentation by our attendees, some useful information going forward. You've had a lot of lovely comments to say thank you for sharing. Some people have asked about, is your presentation available post-webinar? And yes, we'll make this available on the APM website. Roy's happy to share the presentation. So, Roy, if you don't mind answering a couple of questions.
I'll do my best.
One we have here is from John, and John asked, how do you manage assurance in an agile environment?
Very good one. I've got a couple of answers to that question. One is many of the principles are really pretty much the same. It's the way in which you apply them which is different. Yeah, we do have. That's what part of the answer. Another part of the answer is I've never actually applied assurance in an agile environment. Agile was not something that TfL adopted on any sort of wide scale. So I don't have any particular insight myself. However, this was clearly an interesting area for the world, and the Assurance SIG did publish a guide, Assurance of Agile Delivery. I don't have any information to hand to put up on the screen here, but it is actually a downloadable guide from the APM. I think it's been pretty well received, and it's a little bit out of date in terms of some of the terminology. I think has moved on, as one would expect in an agile world. So there is we've got some thoughts to do an update to that. But please, my first port of call really is to go to that guide. If you've got any follow-up questions, if I can't deal with them, I can pass them on to the lead authors of that guide.
Perfect. Thank you, Roy. Alexander, if you're happy to answer one more, please can you explain the meaning of P3M?
Oh, sorry. Oh dear, jargon. P3, Project, Program and Portfolio Management. So it's just an abbreviation, P cubed.
Perfect. Thank you. Hope that helps. Don has asked, how does assurance link with or differ from project and program health checks and maturity assessments?
Right, well, let's just take one of these each in turn. Health checks, I would say, is a valid assurance technique. My experience is, I used to do things like that at TfL, certainly in the early days. It's a fairly light touch type of review. It can be done, I think actually there's an opportunity to do it on a sort of monitoring data basis as well. It is definitely a valid assurance activity, element of assurance. And the other one, sorry, what was the other one, Rob?
Let me just jump back to it. Sorry, health checks and maturity assessments.
Maturity assessments. It's just interesting. I think you could argue it as being an assurance mechanism, but it really depends on how it's used. I would I'd sort of go to the 6 principles of being of the assurance, and how many of those does it tick? So is it being done independently? There's an element of independence in it. Is it making conclusions, drawing conclusions, making recommendations, and is there going to be follow up from it? So I think it's the way it's sort of potentially a valid way assurance mechanism, but it really depends on the way that you use it.
Perfect, thank you. There's probably about 10 or 12 additional questions, Roy. So would you mind if I sent those through to you, and perhaps we could get those online for people to go and check after the webinar?
Sure, very happy to do that.
Perfect. But I will leave it on a positive note. Cole has said, excellent, thank you. Who'd have thought I could get excited about assurance? So,
I'm going to quote you like Cole.
So
thank you.
There's so many more positive messages saying thank you, and I'll definitely send those to you as well, Roy.
Okay.
I would like to say thank you on behalf of APM for giving up your time to present. Equally, I'd like to extend my thanks to everyone who's joined us. I think we almost hit 400 at one point, so that's really great. And I wish everyone well. I also like to mention our volunteers at APM who are producing a lot of great webinars. So please go and visit the APM website, have a look on the events tab, and you can see a whole host of webinars coming up in the next couple of months. So on that note, Roy, thank you again, and I hope everyone keeps well.
My pleasure. Bye-bye, everybody. Thank you for your time.